Coming up, the numbers that rule our world.
As I started to think about this, it's also clear that there is no the economy, right? It's not a tangible thing. It's not an observable phenomenon.
Author and investor Zachary Karabell explains why our economic indicators need to be updated. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
It's a pleasure to introduce our speaker, Zachary Karabell. His articles have appeared in Newsweek, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, The Los Angeles Times, Foreign Affairs, and The Washington Post, and he is the author of 11 previously published books. Of late, he is perhaps best known for The Edgy Optimist, a column he writes for Reuters and The Atlantic. We are delighted to welcome him back to the Carnegie Council, this time to discuss the leading indicators, a short history of numbers that rule our world.
I wrote this book based on just a set of questions that I'd had, which was, particularly when I was acting as an investment manager, the degree to which a limited set of numbers disseminated on a regular basis were shaping an immense amount of outcomes and shaping our sensibility of what's going on in the world. And that we had come to live in this world which willy-nilly, I mean, whether you are really interested in any of this or not, informs our sense of how are we doing. You know, are we doing well, are we doing badly? And that often the answer to that question is entirely dependent on what a limited set of numbers tell us is happening. Primarily, of course, GDP, but also our unemployment rate, also our inflation rate, interest rates, housing numbers. Because in the most basic sense of the word, none of us have a personal relationship or a tangible relationship to this thing called the economy. And as I started to think about this, it's also clear that there is no the economy, right? It's not a tangible thing. It's not an observable, natural occurring phenomenon. And the idea that it is and that it's like something that you can measure, assess, plan, and gauge as if it were the laws of physics or a naturally occurring phenomenon is very much a hallmark of our age, but misses the degree to which the entire framework is just made up. And I don't say made up from a negative place, like it's all just made up, but literally it is all just made up, right? The economy, these statistics, these numbers are just a series of statistics and numbers and measurements that a set of human beings invented at a moment in time. And what's even more extraordinary is that that moment in time is a much nearer moment to our present than you would think, given the way in which we talk about these things. There is a casual degree to which we discuss things like the economy with reference to these numbers as if they'd always been there. All of these numbers, every single one that we use so intimately in our lives, that come at us in metronomic waves of numbing regularity, are the product of the 1930s and the 1940s. And not only the product of the 1930s and the 1940s, but they didn't become woven into our popular sense of who we are and how we're doing well until the 1950s and 1960s. Well until the 20th century, most countries thought of their kind of success and legitimacy based on land, farming output, men under arms, and their ability to contest other nations and other armies. So trade and farming numbers, you know, states kept because that was the primary source of revenue. You needed to know how much farming was being produced and how much trade because that was the only way you could fill the coffers in order to hire the army. But you know, well until the 1930s, there was very little else. Throughout the entire 19th century, in fact, there is no meaningfully embedded social concept of unemployment, or employment for that matter. Most people didn't have jobs, they worked farms, and even if they had a job, the idea of a job is an industrial era creation. So, you know, for much of the 19th century, classical economics emerges with the belief that there is no such thing as unemployment, because there are always jobs that need doing in a world pre-20th century where there's too much stuff to be done and too few people to do it. So if you're not working, it's because you're a vagrant, or you're drunk, or you're idle, or you're incapacitated, or you're dead. Even then, there's no concept. What happens in the Great Depression and World War II is something bad happens in 1929. It's not called the Great Depression because, you know, it didn't happen yet. And everyone knew things bad were happening, but they didn't quite know what was happening. It was sort of flying blind. And Hoover, who had been an apostle of scientific management, is receiving a huge amount of criticism for not doing enough to address how bad things are. But of course, there's even an argument of how bad things are. So Hoover allows for an augmented budget for the sleepy Bureau of Labor Statistics to start collecting information about the employment picture in the United States, drawing on some work that had been done in the progressive era, by people who were trying to support unions in their efforts to extract a living wage from big companies. So early work is done, and a little bit of an employment picture is created, which immediately gives Franklin Roosevelt and the adversaries of Hoover, who feel like he's not doing enough, ammunition to say, things are really bad and you're not doing anything about it. So Hoover creates a number that then gets used by his adversaries to defeat him in the election, thereby being hoist on his own statistical petard. So you have the beginnings of an employment rate, but it's only the beginnings. There's no unemployment rate, there's no figure, there's no number. There's just early attempts to figure out how do you count it, how do you define it, right? Unemployment is not a counting of someone not with a job. It's a statistical definition of what it means for the system not to provide enough employment for people who want it or need it. So you actually have to define unemployment as the absence of a job in the presence of looking for one. And then you have to figure out, well, how long do you have to be looking for one in order to be qualified for looking for one? Then it was 8 weeks, now it's 4 weeks. A lot of definitions have to go into this. Then you have the New Deal, right, to address the issue of employment and farming and banks. And if you're going to do all these things that have never been done before, you need to be able to say that we started with X, and X was bad, and then we spent a lot of money on all these programs, and we changed the nature of government, and it led to Y, and Y is better. But unless you knew what X was and Y was, there was no way to make that statement. So that leads to the creation of national accounts, national income accounts, which was kind of the brainchild of an emigre Russian economist named Simon Kuznets, who later earns a Nobel Prize for this, and had been doing work on this in a kind of sleepy backwater way in both the government and academia, and then is kind of called on to infuse this with some national urgency, and is supported by the British at the time and people like Keynes. And that creates this national account system that allows you to measure the output of your economic system, so that Roosevelt could start saying by 1937, when I came into office, our national income was X, and we did all these things in terms of New Deal programs, and now it's Y, and Y is bigger. But even then, it was a definition of output at market prices. There was a lot that it left out, and those then become the foundation of GNP, which then becomes GDP. And in that time, it was simply a measurement of the output of an economic system at market prices. And the final spur in all of this, including the spur toward creating an inflation gauge, was World War II. So you had these national income accounts. But in World War II, the thing that the United States really needed to know in order to successfully fight after 1941 was how much of its domestic industry could be turned toward war production. How many car factories could be made into tank factories and plane factories and gun factories and ammunition factories, without so imperiling the domestic economic system that you won the war but your domestic system collapsed. And GNP, which was an outgrowth of these national accounts, which incorporated government spending and allowed for some measurement of the potential of the economic system versus what was actually being done, was one of the primary tools that gave policymakers the confidence of, we're going to make sure we make this many tanks and this many planes and this many guns, and we're still going to have a domestic economic base that's solid at the end of it. Which is why within government circles, the invention of GDP and GNP was considered one of the tools that win the war, on par in its own way with the creation of the nuclear bomb. I mean, whether that's true or not, it's what people have said. So by the end of World War II, you've got this really nascent framework of employment and GDP and inflation, but they're just tools for policymakers that were designed for certain real challenges in the world. In the 1950s, you've got the beginning of the Cold War. This is like a little potted history of how these numbers came to be. In the 1950s, the nature of the Cold War that emerges is partly ideological, partly nuclear proliferation, but largely whose economic system is better. And if you're going to prove that your economic system is better than the other person's, you need numbers that say, hey, we're making more stuff than you are. Our stuff is better. Our quality of life is going up. And so the United States and the Soviets and then everyone else starts engaging in this kind of, my GDP is bigger than your GDP. Our inflation rate's lower than your inflation rate. My quality of living is better than your quality of living. We're hiring more people than you are more productively. And meanwhile, you have this world of new nations entering the system, having decolonized and joining the United Nations. And the first thing you have to do in the 1950s, if you're a new nation, and the first thing you do is you build an army, or you set up, you put people in your national insignia, you design a flag, you probably unveil a national airline, and you start measuring GDP. And you start measuring GDP because if you're a new country and you want to go to this new institution called the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund or any other economic institution, say, hey, we want to augment our activity, you have to be able to show that the reception of that money will lead to more GDP, will lead to more economic output. So everybody in the world starts measuring this thing called the economy that hadn't existed 20 years before in exactly the same way, as dictated by the UN framework of national accounts, which comes right out of Kuznets, right out of Keynes, and right out of Great Britain and the United States. And so lo and behold, by the 1960s, we're suddenly living in a world where these numbers are shaping policy, shaping attitudes, and shaping international life. And then you have organizations like Fortune and Forbes and Henry Luce, touting the wonders of this economic system that is America as being the leading part of the world and using these numbers as the fodder for the argument. So in many ways, and I'm going to just jump all the way forward, we still live in that world in terms of how we talk about this thing called the economy. What we are doing today by relying so heavily on things like GDP and employment, and then this whole suite of private statistics that grew up kind of in its wake, is we're using a really, really good 1950s set of tools that were designed to answer questions of global depression, World War II, and 1950s industrial nation states that made stuff. We're really, really good at measuring that world, but we're not living in that world. The fact that it isn't a good thing now does not retroactively make it a bad thing then. So I'm not suggesting that the invention of GDP and unemployment and any of these numbers was wrong at the time. I'm suggesting that they've outlived their utility, especially commensurate with the kind of weight we put on them. And the weight we put on them is twofold. One is what happens within the kind of the professional economist policy realm, and the other is the public realm of how do we understand what's going on. So let me give you two examples for this, one for each. The policy realm is really interesting. A little more than 5 years ago, President Obama gets up in February of 2009 in the midst of this financial crisis and somewhat of an economic implosion and says, we're going to pass the stimulus bill for $787 billion, and the result will be that it will create or save 3.5 million jobs. What is it that allows for a specific statement of spend X and a very precise number of jobs are going to be created? He didn't say 3.4, he didn't say 3.6, he said 3.5. And he didn't say it because he came up with it. He said it because there's an entire framework of economic policy making that has created formulas that go, well, if we have this thing called an economy and this thing called GDP, and if it's not producing the amount that we think with employment failing, and we spend X based on patterns that we've observed, we can say with some degree of confidence that spending X will lead to this amount of job creation subsequently. But what's fascinating about that is if these numbers have only existed for barely 60 years, and the amount of recessions that have required that kind of spending have been, you could count on one hand. And then if you try to include examples from other countries where maybe you could count on two hands, you've created a framework that is expressed with this kind of mechanistic rigidity based on a remarkably few data points to support whether or not that is even true. My issue with that is not that we should or should not have done it. It's that we simply lack, based on what these numbers are and how long we've had them, we lack the ability to calculate outcomes with that degree of certitude, and yet we do so all the time. The Congressional Budget Office does so all the time because it has to by mandate. A mandate that, incidentally, only has existed for 20 years. There was no Congressional Budget Office before the mid-1970s, and it didn't score legislation until the passage of the Gramm-Rudman Act in the mid-1980s, and it didn't score legislation the way it currently does until the early 1990s. And yet now it's as if there was always this holy arbiter of government spending through which the calculus of if we spend X now, what will happen in the future? All of which are based on a limited number of formulas. One more example of that. 2012 presidential election, one of the things that was said most frequently, or at least I heard most frequently, was no president has ever been reelected with an unemployment rate greater than 7.2% or whatever the number was. So think about that. That seems like a very strong historical pattern, kind of an ironclad one, and it led month after month after month for an intense amount of attention to be paid to the unemployment rate, focused, laser-like on, was it going down, what was it going to be, to the point where a good unemployment number in November led, Jack Welch famously to go, oh, well, those Chicago boys will stop at nothing to make the unemployment rate look lower. But what's really interesting about that statement is, think about it, it's presented as a factual, strong historical pattern. There was no unemployment rate until the late 1940s, and no unemployment rate that the Bureau of Labor Statistics released publicly until at least some point in the 1950s. But let's say, for the sake of argument, it existed and it was disseminated by 1948. Between 1948 and 2012, there were 16 presidential elections. 7 people ran for re-election during that period of time, and 2 lost. Jimmy Carter in 1980 and George Herbert Walker Bush in 1992. So to make the statement that no president has ever been reelected with an unemployment rate greater than 7.2% is to say that in the 7 times that this has happened with this number, it's never happened. And as anyone who knows anything about statistics would know, the margin of error in a set of 7 is so large as to be meaningless to make any conclusive statements about. And yet we make them all the time. Now that's a much simpler example than the, if we spend $787 billion, we'll create 3.5 million jobs. But it's the same pattern of how we've used a limited amount of information to guide us in ways that at least I think we cannot possibly be guided by. Final example in all this is, if our system has shifted, which I think we all believe it has, and I think we all intuitively know it has, then even if those patterns were established, there's no reason to think they would continue to be true if other things have changed. So think about the relationship between spending and jobs, and GDP and jobs. You know, all GDP measures is how much stuff we're capable of producing. It is completely neutral about whether that stuff is beneficial for the long term, whether it leads to a sustainable trajectory of growth, what the stuff is. If a hurricane hits New York again and a series of mudslides hit California, the cleanup efforts of those natural disasters will be good for GDP because we will spend money and that will go into output. If a coal plant pollutes a river, the cleanup will be good for GDP. You know, the BP oil spill was very good for the GDP of that region. But I don't think any of us would say a priori that in order to boost GDP this year, we should have more natural disasters and a few man-made ones. So the idea that, you know, we are measuring the system that we want with these numbers is highly in question. And the final issue is we live in a world where we are rich in information technologies and increasingly not based on a manufacturing industry, but not in the sense of output, right? GDP measures output. A factory gets built today, it adds to GDP in the area in which it's built. The factory produces more stuff, that adds to our GDP, particularly if it's domestic stuff. But if it's robotics and information technology that allow the same factory to employ 500 people that would have employed 5,000 people 30 years ago, then you've created something that's positive for GDP, good for output, lowers inflation, and does nothing for job growth, which means all those patterns that we believe exist have broken down. Trade patterns, also. All of our trade figures rely on a 20th century and before belief that everything you buy is made somewhere. Increasingly, we live in a world where everything we buy is made everywhere, whether because the intellectual property comes from multiple sources, or more to the point, because the components of it come from a supply chain that has spread out globally where it's most advantageous. That's true for a carpet, it's true for a t-shirt, it's true for an iPhone. But our trade figures, because they are limited by how they were defined, that a nation and a factory in a country makes something, and it either gets consumed domestically or sold foreign, is unable to account for any of that. It's unable to account for the intellectual property that goes into an iPhone. Every time an iPhone gets bought in the United States by you, by me, by any of us, it shows up as an import from China. $200 import, $250 import. Because it underwent its final substantive transformation, which is how the World Trade Organization defines this, in a factory in China. So every time you buy that, $250 statistically leaves the country, or $200, whatever the number is, and shows up as a negative on our economic lives. You know, it's a bad thing economically, and it leads to a perception of the decline of the American manufacturing base. Well, a bunch of people have, taken apart the iPhone and tried to show where it's made and how it's made. About $8, maybe $10 of it actually goes to China in the form of the labor of those people in Shenzhen. Because the fact is, it isn't made in China. Its final assembly occurs in a factory in China. Its chipsets are made in Germany. Its chipsets are made in Korea. Its chipsets are made in the United States. Its plastics might be made in Malaysia or Thailand. Some of its components are made in Taiwan, and above all, its intellectual property is made in Cupertino, California. And if you were to disaggregate all that and apply each of those things to where they're from, we would have a very different trade picture than the one we currently depict, particularly if you did that for 100,000 products. The problem is we can't do that for 100,000 products. So we're left with this monthly trade report that shows a trade deficit with China and shows the ways in which our manufacturing base is slipping without showing all these other things that are not only equally important, they're probably much more important. So the question in all this is like, what do we do about it? I'm under no illusions, and none of us should be, that we're going to suddenly spend billions of dollars at a national level and billions more at a global level to improve our statistical framework for how we see the world. So we're stuck with the framework we have right now, in the sense of these numbers will keep coming and will keep coming. One of the greatest things we could all do is recognize that there is no simple number that is going to answer any of the meaningful questions that any of us have. These are all averages. These are all complicated systems reduced to 2-digit numbers, maybe 3 digits if things are really good or really bad. That's it. Per capita income is a terrible number to try to assess, is this system meeting people's needs? Because all per capita income is our population, including children, divided by our GDP. So if Bill Gates walks into the back of the room today, we're all per capita millionaires, but it tells us nothing about income in any meaningful way. So many of our statistics are simple averages. The unemployment rate. No one of us have an unemployment rate of 6.5%. And you'd be hard-pressed to go anywhere in the country where you magically replicate that rate. Detroit does not have the same unemployment rate as Las Vegas. Las Vegas does not have the same unemployment rate as Nebraska, which, by the way, has never had an unemployment rate greater than 5% throughout the entire economic crisis because of agriculture and fracking. So the idea that there's one unemployment rate that actually describes a national problem is itself a fiction that leads to fictional policies designed to lower a national rate that essentially doesn't exist. There's unemployment problems in this country that are deep and profound. If you're an African-American male without a high school degree, some people have said you have an employment rate of 10%. If you're a college-educated woman, you have an unemployment rate of 4%. There is no national policy that either the Federal Reserve or the government is going to do that is going to lower the rate nationally when the rate nationally only exists as a statistical thing. It's not real. The only thing that matters is the questions you have, and the ability then to find numbers and information and data, and to some degree statistics, that help you answer those questions. I'm not sure what question in the world we live today, even for policymakers, GDP or the unemployment rate or the inflation rate answers. Maybe you could say the inflation rate answers the central bank question of, is there price stability? And given that our mandate is maintaining it, having some sense of what it is in velocity of change is important. But for the most part, unless you are a central banker, and most of us are not and will not be, I'm not sure what question these numbers answer. I know what questions they were designed to answer, which they answer quite well. How many tanks and planes can the United States make industrially without imperiling its economy? Are our programs working in the New Deal to stabilize this system? But what question does GDP answer for you and for me, What question do any of us have individually, or does any business have, that is answered by these numbers? Now, we all have lots of questions. Should I buy a home is a big question individuals have. Should I invest in future expansion is a big question that businesses have. The should I buy a home one, how is that answered by the National Association of Home Builders housing starts last month, or the National Association of Mortgage Originators mortgage originations, or by what the average 30-year rate is as published by banks and disseminated on business pages? That could be completely true to your experience, and it could be completely meaningless. And the only way you'll know is by finding out what are the home prices in the area in which you live, and can you get a mortgage, and what are the employment dynamics. And what's really interesting is that we now live in a world where the answering of those questions individually with data and statistics, and I call them bespoke statistics, or I say we ought to create bespoke statistics, has never been easier. You can go onto an app, you can go onto anything and find the home sales in the past 60 days within a 10-mile radius, and find what they were bought for originally 4 years before, and what they sold for, and what the rates are in that area. And if you'd had to do that 10 years ago, if you'd had to create your own numbers 10 years ago, I don't know if you even could have. I mean, if you'd gone to your local town hall, or whoever kept the records of land deeds, and you said, I want every sale within the past 60 days, I'm not sure someone would have given them to you. Maybe they would have. Maybe they would have done it only with a 6-month lag. The point being, it has never been easier to find the information you need and craft the statistics that answer that in a world where we cleave ever more to a national narrative that doesn't even pertain. Same thing for a business. Should I spend money? Is GDP going to tell you whether or not your business is going to do well? Certainly not a big business, right? GDP could fall 2%, Amazon could still grow 5%, because all the malls go out of business and everybody starts shopping online because you don't have to drive to the malls. Google can do really well throughout this period, even as the advertising and print industry is imploding, because whatever marginal spending exists goes online and it goes away from those traditional industries. None of those national figures are going to tell you whether or not that's a good investment or whether Google's pursuing a good strategy. So I don't think there are many questions that any of us have individually, or a small business that any of us might create, or a large business any of us might run, that will be well aided by believing that there are patterns you can glean in these numbers that will dictate helpfully your strategy ahead. And then finally, you add in the global element to all of this, whereby we have no global numbers. We have a lot of national numbers that we divide and add globally. Even the UN keeps no international statistics because it has neither the staff nor the funding. It collates national numbers and tries to create some sort of international picture. Same thing with the World Bank. So we live in this world where we have immense information at our fingertips. And part of the call is, let's use it, right? Let's use it to guide us meaningfully and create the numbers that we need. Because using a 1950s roadmap that is increasingly not the world we're living in is only going to get us lost. And while there is some utility for maintaining the information that comes with these numbers, they are as much misleading indicators in terms of how we use them as they are leading indicators in terms of how they were created. So let's use the information we have and make the power of the information age real, and allow for these leading indicators to have been a great invention that helped us understand the world and shape it constructively. And let's let it go. So thank you very much.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.